Okay, we are now recording. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining again for another wonderful session of ASEV, Eastern Section, Grapevines to Wine, Hangtime, Lunch and Learn. Good gosh, that's a big old name. It's probably not lunch where a lot of you are, but it's a hang time. It's a place where we can chat and talk about discussions that are relevant across this country. If you are new to us, ASEV stands for American Society of Enology and Viticulture Eastern Section. There is a national organization which is comprised of mostly California and a few other states on the West Coast. When we think of Eastern Section, that can be anything from New Mexico all the way over to New York, upwards to Canada and down to Florida. So it's the rest of the country. And uh, my name is Nathan Neeson. I serve as a county extension agent in Northeast Georgia, and I serve on the ASEV board. And one of the ideas I had was bringing a hang time online discussion such as this, because we were only having our conference. And this is a great way to extend the body of knowledge to the industry and to other universities, and share some of the work we're doing and some things that are relevant. So each month we kind of have a theme, and this month's theme was kind of talking about, since it's the fall, a lot of times in the fall here, especially on the East Coast, we have the beautiful leaf change of colors and the senescence of the leaves. So I thought, well, how appropriate it would be to say leaf change in the fall. Is it the sign of a healthy or unhealthy vines? We'll dig deeper into grapevine, red blotch, crown gall, and who's at risk. So what we'll be doing for today's session is discussing with our fine panel here why we see leaf color changes in grapevines. So some of you may be experts in this. Some of you may need a little bit of brushing up. But we're going to kind of cover the basics. But before we started, we're going to get our panel introduced. So Dr. Pell, I will start with you.
All right. Thank you, Nathan. I'm Dave Apple. I'm a professor emeritus from the Department of Plant Pathology and Microbiology at Texas A&M University.
Thank you, Dr. Femi.
All right. Good day, everyone. Olufemi Alabi is my name. I'm a professor and extension plant pathologist in the same department as Dave. And I'm an extension faculty. I'm located in the Research and Extension Center down south of Texas.
Dr. Brannon.
Phil Brannon. I'm with the University of Georgia, plant pathology department, and grapes are one of the commodities I work on here from the standpoint of extension and research for diseases.
All right, and I see that JC is on now. Let's see if I can get her to do a quick introduction. She's also with Texas A&M. There she is. JC is putting you quickly on the spot. How are you? Let's see.
Here's being muted.
Sorry about that. Got it. Yep. Just now let me do that. Yeah, I'm good. How are you guys?
Doing good. If you'll just give us a quick introduction.
Sure. So JC Lewis, program manager at the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Department of Horticultural Sciences. That's a mouthful. Viticulture and Sustainable Fruit Applied Research Lab and Program.
Perfect. Wonderful panelist here. We may have somebody from Clemson join us later on as well, so we'll allow them to join in. But I'll get us started kind of as the host of the session. So there's lots of things, right, panel, that we see out in the vineyard and we go, it's a red, or it's a coloration change, it's a pigment change, and sometimes these things can be very much natural, and sometimes they can not be, and be early symptoms and signs of something that we should be a little bit more concerned about. So I Googled red grape leaves, and when you Google red grape leaves, it pops up with a combination of all sorts of beautiful red grape leaves, except all the red pictures don't look the same. Some have interveinal chlorosis, some are spotty, some are marginal, and some are completely red or purple. And so here on the East Coast, when we kind of talked about this the other day, we don't see a lot of those leaf change colors naturally. And that's why JC's hopefully can speak to some of this. If we see a red leaf here in Georgia in the fall, right there at pre-harvest or post-harvest, normally we're looking at either a nutrient deficiency showing up post-harvest or possibly crown gall or those things. But talking to, again, things that I learned talking to other viticulturalists across the country, it can be a very much a natural process. And that may just be the naivety of me. I'm just a county agent. I don't study this every day. If anybody wants to speak to just the natural appearance of some of these leaves and maybe that it is a natural thing and we don't need to be concerned about it. JC, do you want to make a few mentions of that?
Sure. So I talked to Dave just a little bit about this before I came on, just to make sure I was getting my head around what you guys were talking about. And I think it's possible that what you're looking at, if you're talking about post-harvest reddening of the leaves, we see that sometimes, and growers refer to it as a number of things. I've had growers, one of the terms that I've heard before is he called it sugar burn. And I don't know where he got that, but I think that is his way of talking about something that's happening after fruit has been removed. And one of the things that we will see is some reddening of leaves after harvest, after fruit removal. And it really can vary a lot between variety, but also between vineyards. You don't see it as often with hand harvested vineyards. You'll see it more commonly with vineyards that have been mechanically harvested. And what we attribute a lot of that to is just some stress response and micro assaults in the canopy. For instance, anytime you have an injury, and this is the same reason that you would end up with red leaves due to crown gall or split trunk. Anytime you have an injury, you can have an ethylene response as a systemic reaction to that injury. Well, ethylene is a chlorophyll degrader. So when you have large amounts of ethylene that have been released into the plant as a response to stress, particularly the stress associated, with getting banged around by a harvester, then you can end up with reddening of the leaves, which is in reality just that ethylene degrading the chlorophyll in the leaves. So that's one way, especially with regard to post-harvest, that can happen.
Okay. I'll just real quickly, I'll pause and just introduce Elizabeth. If you want to unmute yourself and introduce yourself, I'm glad you could join us earlier.
Sure. Thank you. Sorry, I'm a little bit late. We just had a student committee meeting that just got out. So thanks for inviting me. My name's Elizabeth Sinowitz. I go by Libby. I'm an assistant professor in plant virology at Clemson University. But my background in my PhD was working on red blotch. I did my PhD at Cornell with Mark Fuchs. And so we published a lot of the original kind of ecology studies on red blotch. And yeah, again, I'm thankful to be here.
Glad you could join us. Absolutely. And we're just getting started here. You haven't missed much, just some introductions. And what we're looking at again, what causes grape leaves to change colors, and why they turn red. JC just talked to us about, that sometimes it can be as a stress response. Do we see coloration changes just naturally like you would a maple or an oak tree? I mean, are grapes going to naturally change colors? Do we have some cultivars or varieties out there? Can anybody on the panel speak to that? Again, we don't see it here on the East Coast, but I've had one of my other advisors across in they used to work in New Mexico and said, well, sometimes it's fine. It's just a healthy response. It's a normal thing. Anybody want to comment to that?
Sure, I can jump in a little. And so grape grows through an annual growth cycle, and definitely, after harvest, the leaves will start becoming senescent, and eventually, especially in cold regions, the leaves will drop. Reading through the literature, and when I was doing my PhD, I also had the chance to visit in a lot of vineyards in Washington State, and Of course, trying to, do some epidemiological studies on leaf roll viruses. And what we do see is that even for red cultivars, be it Cabernet Sauvignon or Merlot or any kind of red cultivar, a vine that is not infected with leaf roll viruses will, retain its green color. And towards after harvest, before it becomes, before those leaves drop, the best you get is they will start turning yellow, and then eventually they will drop off, but they will not turn red if they are not showing symptoms of leaf roll. And I actually have a picture here of a particular vineyard, where we were able to picture two vines side by side. I don't know if you can see my slide.
You're good. Yep.
Okay. So on one side, you see, this vine, with the red leaves, that's a confirmed, positive vine, positive for one of the leaf roll viruses, in this case, leaf roll 3. The vine adjacent to it or next to it is the same variety, the same age, and this is post-harvest, and you can see the leaves. The older leaves are turning yellow, and eventually they will drop off. So this is a clear case of virus-induced, color change. And I believe, Libby can speak to red blotch. A similar situation is what we also have with red blotch. But having said that, like Jesse mentioned, the color change, turning to red, especially in red cultivar, seems to be like a kind of stress response. And we've seen situations also where, we'll see, so everything comes down to the pattern, the pattern of the coloration and the timing of the symptoms. And maybe we'll, delve a little into that, but I'll allow Libby to speak a little bit about maybe, what they also see with red blotch.
Yes, thank you for transitioning that. And so I do want to say, for our attendees on this conference, on this session, feel free to type in questions in the Q&A box, or if you want to verbally ask a question, raise your hand symbol, and it puts you to the top of the attendee list. I'll try to keep my eyes out, and you can ask a question. So I did forget to mention that we want to have this to be interactive. So if you have questions, or you say, "Oh no, we have coloration every year and it's fine," but what Dr. Oliby's, what I saw again is that we see a lot of yellowing. But if we see a deep red, maybe we should be slightly concerned. But what he transitioned to was timing. So we think fall color change, right? We're coming up to, temperatures are starting to drop here in Georgia. So let's break these things apart. So we've mentioned leaf roll and red blotch. So I will let whomever wants to jump in and talk about red blotch. Let's quickly just define it real quick, and then maybe discuss some timing and a few pictures of those symptoms.
Femi, did you say that you prepared some pictures of red blotch? I'm sorry, I didn't prepare any slides.
I'll do that right now, share that.
So yeah, I mean, they're both viruses, but they're totally different viruses, completely unrelated. So yes, so this is what symptoms of red blotch look like in the field. These pictures were taken in California. So unlike leaf roll, typically the symptoms stay more localized to the older leaves, like kind of the lower part of the canopy when you have like vertical shoot positioning like this. And sometimes the symptoms will kind of coalesce and cover the whole leaf, and sometimes they'll just kind of stay as red blotches, and sometimes they'll defoliate too. It really is a cultivar specific and timing specific situation. But if you have something that looks like this, where the symptoms are mostly localized to the lower part of the canopy, that would be suggestive of red blotch more so than leaf roll. It's not always as clear cut as this, certainly. I've done a little bit of work actually with Dr. Brannon in a vineyard in northern Georgia, and we found red blotch in this vineyard, and now we've mapped it 2 years in a row. So mapping symptoms and also looking at red blotch presence or absence in those vines. And we can't correlate presence of the virus to symptoms because there's so many other factors that we're seeing in vineyards, at least that one vineyard in the southeast. But yeah, again, there are a lot of cultivar specific differences too. The biggest differences are between white fruited and red fruited cultivars. So this is in Chardonnay, what red blotch symptoms look like, this interveinal chlorosis, and that's not really suggestive of a virus at all. So symptoms can be a really difficult predictor of virus infection.
Dr. Albee, you talked about location again. That those symptoms are typically going to be pronounced in the lower canopy.
Yes. So like Libby mentioned, those symptoms will actually start. You start seeing them on the lower leaves, and then with time, they will start advancing upwards. The other thing also to keep in mind is that so even things like potassium or phosphorus deficiency can cause intervene, some kind of reddening of the leaves. People will describe some of those nutritional symptoms as starting from the leaf margins and then working their way inwards. But in terms of timing, so the interesting thing with both leaf rot and red blotch is that you can have a vine that is infected, and once that vine is infected, for its lifespan. But what happens is that when during dormancy, you don't see any obvious sign of virus infection. But we know that you can take cuttings from that vine, take it to the lab, run tests, and if it's positive for leaf rot or red blotch, you can detect the virus. Same thing, during the vegetative growth stage, bud break all the way to flowering. That vine looks perfectly happy. The leaves are green, everything is fine. You can't tell, that vine is infected with either leaf rot or red blotch. The time when the symptoms begin to appear is just right about the time of arising, when the berry maturation, starts. When the berry color starts changing in red, for example. And this is when you start seeing symptoms of leaf rot and red blotch, and the pattern that Libby just mentioned is typically what you see. So on one hand, I would, and maybe Dave will, and Philip will talk about things like crown gall and things like that. But I think that timing effect is what distinguishes these virus infections from say crown gall or some other kinds of damage that can induce reddening of the leaves.
But ultimately, what's the outcome of red blotch?
There have been a few studies published on the effects on fruit and on wine separately. So again, it's cultivar specific, but I think there's like lower anthocyanins typically and lower Brix in the infected fruits. And there are other effects, I think, again, cultivar specific. I'm not a wine expert by any means or a physiologist, so probably not the best person to speak about that. But I know there is also a sort of hypothesized relationship between the symptoms on the leaves and the symptoms in the fruit, where it seems like the sugar levels are higher in the leaves, and then they're not being translocated to the fruit. And so that's why you see potentially some of the symptoms in the leaves, but also the lower sugar levels in the fruit.
Libby, what about the survivals of the vines with red blotch? Is there a good correlation between the level of symptom development and vine survival?
I've never seen red blotch kill a vine. It may predispose it to some other things that might kill the vine, but I don't think there's been any real convincing studies of that. But it's not like Pierce's disease or something that will actually kill the vine.
But we will not see red in a white grape. Is that correct?
No.
Not from red blotch, no.
Okay.
So that's one of the tricky things with white. Some people will tell you that they see consistency between infection by leaf rot or red blotch and some kind of intervenal chlorosis that Libby mentioned, but it's never consistent. And it's so confusing because a lot of times, those symptoms also could easily be nutritional deficiency. But one thing that is very unique with leaf roll is that, towards harvest, you start seeing, that downward rolling of the leaves, especially in chronically infected vines. And that downward rolling of the leaves is more diagnostic for leaf roll, but not so much for red blotch. But in terms of impact, one of the things that people have measured over time is looking at things like pruning weight. And I think a lot of people, many studies from different areas have recorded, consistently, reduced pruning weight due to, virus infection, which probably translates to, reduced vigor of the vine.
Right. Well, sounds good. Let's transition into some leaf roll virus. You have some photos there, Dr. Femi, that we can look at and kind of differentiate on the viruses.
Yeah, absolutely. So similar to, so this is the picture you are seeing here is again side-by-side comparison of an infected leaf roll infected vine versus an LD vine. And as you can see, the pattern of the reddening, you see more of those, reddening of the interveinal area, reddening of the leaves, towards the bottom canopy and less so at the top. The cartoon at the bottom is basically telling you it's not just one virus, there are multiple viruses, and you can't tell which of these 3 viruses, for instance, is causing this symptom. You really have to run a test. But in terms of, really, close-up photos on the leaves, I believe, the one I'm pointing out right now is a mellow leaf that is, was tested positive for leaf roll 3, and you can see the classic, purplish or purple reddish, discoloration. But the interesting thing is, around the vein, everything remains green. It never turns red with leaf roll. This is another cultivar right at the bottom. I believe this is a Cabernet Sauvignon vine and similar situation. And the ones that, next year are the whites. This is Chardonnay. This is the kind of, fluorosis that you see, but then, it's really very difficult to, attribute this to virus just by looking at it. But one thing that is consistent is, towards, after harvest, and towards, as the vine ages, if it's, infected with any of the leaf rolls, be it red or white, you start seeing this downward rolling of the leaves, and I don't know of any other pathogen that will, that's been, that such a downward rolling of the leaf has, been found to be, diagnostic. So this seems to be the most diagnostic symptom of leaf roll that you see.
So this is a situation where, as you go through the season, that roll becomes more pronounced.
Yes, that roll becomes more pronounced. If you definitely see that roll, it's a telltale sign that you probably should take some samples and send it off for diagnosis.
Perfect. Well, that's great. It's good information. That's the whole point of this session, is to kind of get some of these visuals out there so people can refresh their memories of what they should be aware of. Let's transition. Let's keep going because we got 2 more to cover. I'm going to let Dr. Brandon and Dr. Apple review Pierce's disease and crown gall. So I don't know who's got pictures of what. I know, Dr. Brandon, you may have some pictures of crown gall. So y'all go ahead.
Let me see if I can pull up my screen here. And I don't know, Nathan, do you see my screen now or not yet?
Not yet.
Let's see, I might need to see here if I can get it to where share screen. Here we go. Maybe that's what I got to do.
There it goes.
Do you see something there?
Yep.
Right now I got to figure out how to make it go back where I wanted at the beginning here. All right, so so you see that photograph there, that is crown gall. And the reddening that you're seeing there is pretty distinctive, but I'm going to show you some photographs in a minute that would make you realize you can certainly get confused. But the reddening is so bright and so brilliant with crown gall. And I don't know if it's different in white versus red varieties or not, but at least in this case, you can kind of get a feel for just how dramatic that is. With the crown gall, it will often be scattered throughout the field if it came in with the plants, and if the injury, whatever the injury event, is pretty uniform. But then if you've got cold damage in particular, it's bringing it out, because crown gall is generally going to be associated with a damage of some kind. The bacteria may be in the vine, may have come in with the vines, but until you have injury, you probably won't see that gall development. And so once the galling starts, I guess there was something mentioned about ethylene, but if that's the impact it has, is reddening those leaves, but there has to be a damage event, and then that crown gall continues to damage as the gall develops and disrupts tissue.
And the timing of this, Dr. Brandon, is when?
Well, this is a little bit less clear. I guess it could be a fall or an autumn type thing, but it may be earlier than that, because again, it's a damage event. And then the crown gall has to come out. So I don't think it's going to necessarily always be associated with the fall. I think it'll be more random as to when it occurs. That would be my assessment.
And this could kill the vine, right?
It will, in a lot of cases, kill the vine. It doesn't always kill the vine. Sometimes the symptoms will, let's see if I can go back up here. Let me go for it. I'll show you a symptom in a second, and we'll talk about that, Libby, because I just want to give a little bit more of a thought about crown gall, and then I'll get to some of those, and we'll talk about whether it kills it or not. But the thing about this, to me, we talked about the curling of the leaves. There's some curling involved in this. If you look at these leaves, they are curling, but the thing that's a little bit distinctive by comparison to leaf roll in particular is just the reddening that was mentioned about the veins. I mean, these leaves are really just brilliant red, and the veins are also somewhat reddening as well. So everything's red, and it's uniform throughout the plant. So that's just, you can get things confused, is my point. Some of these things can be relatively confusing at some points. But if you go to the base and you see this is kind of the beginning of crown gall, that's a relatively new, young vine. If that were to continue to develop, it could possibly girdle the vine and kill it outright. This is more advanced, probably older, dead gall tissue. And this is bad. So that's probably, again, going to kill the plant. What I have observed is sometimes if the gall is on one side of the plant, it will form tissue that looks almost like that. And that old dead tissue will slough off, and sometimes those plants will live. So what I've told people to do is just, depending, of course, if the vine's dead, it's dead. But if you've got crown gall and you just can't have, if you can afford to wait, I wouldn't necessarily always rip up the vines and replant immediately, because sometimes we've had pretty significant crown gall and we've just left the vines, and a lot of these galls have sloughed off and the plants have done okay. So that's not 100%. We've also had situations where we've had a lot of crown gall and a lot of the plants died within a year. So it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen sometimes. But if the whole of the trunk is girdled, the plant will die. And so that's been my experience. But it's a bad issue. Now this is another leaf roll, and again, that's also a pretty brilliant red. I think that's a Cabernet, if I'm not mistaken. And the one thing you can see is the vines are kind of clumped together, which I guess you can see that with cold damage and crown gall. But this is where the virus is moving from plant to plant to plant down the row. Now again, that's a very brilliant red, but you do see, if you look closely, you have a lot more of the green margins. And so, and you do see the roll, but again, you can see where you could mix those up potentially. But if you see that and you don't have crown gall, then it's probably going to be the leaf roll virus. I wanted to show this too. So we've been talking about red, but that is Norton or Cynthiana, and that is leaf roll virus on one of the native are near native grapes, and that's very much a yellow. If you were to look at the individual leaves, they're somewhat similar. The yellowing is much more distinct and interveinal, and you still have the green vein. But that would be a leaf roll on Norton. And so the other native grapes can get these viruses. Even if they don't show symptoms, they can probably be a reservoir for some of these viruses. So we have to keep that in mind as well. And then in our case, we've got a lot of wild grapes that are around our vineyards, and it's at least possible that some of them will be a reservoir for viruses. They are there as well. Just real quick on Pierce's disease. The symptomology on Pierce's disease can be somewhat different. Again, it's going to show up probably in early August, similar to some of the viruses and things like that. Red varieties versus white varieties can give radically different symptoms. And you have to actually almost look variety by variety is what you're going to see. This would be a red variety. What I've always noticed is this kind of a purple type margin that extends across the veins. If I see that, and I see a lot of that, I can almost diagnostically tell you that that's Pierce's disease for that leaf. If you send me a photograph and I see that, that is very diagnostic. But you don't always see that. So this is also Pierce's disease, and it is also on a red. But you look at that, it just looks like all those leaves got dried up. Again, the xylem is being obstructed by the bacteria that causes Pierce's disease. That's much more of a browning, almost like a drought-like symptom. But again, it's going to be scattered across the vineyard as opposed to continuous. But again, it's difficult sometimes to pick these things out. There's another shot of Pierce's disease at the end of a row on a vine compared to a healthy vine. The bottom line, when you look at something like that and you see the plant is dying, you would have to suspect that it is Pierce's disease, but there could be other trunk diseases that are in play as well. And so you have to do a thorough examination to try to figure things out. And you can have samples of the leaves taken and actually determine whether or not this is definitely Pierce's disease if you want to get a confirmation of it. Same with the viruses. You can take samples and send those off and determine whether or not there are viruses involved as well. This is a mystery disease that I'm dealing with right now. I'm just going to throw that out there. You can look at this. At first, when the samples came in on this, I thought it was a herbicide damage. But when you get to the field, you don't see side-by-side vines where one has herbicide damage and the other one does not. They're basically grown within each other. There are things that we don't talk about a whole lot in the Southeast, and I do know do exist in other places, but phytoplasmas are another thing as well. Now, it turns out, as far as we can tell, I sent off a sample to AgDia, and they came back and said that this was not a phytoplasma based on their general screening that they have done with that. So I've now gone to, all right, is there some type of virus? Is it a new virus? Is it some other type of virus? And so we're having them do a battery of screening for viruses to see if it will come out as a virus, and sometimes you can get a cross reaction. At least it would tell us it is a virus, but we're not sure. We don't know what that is. You look at these leaves, again, in a vacuum, if you sent me that, I might say there's some type of herbicide damage or something going on with that. And that was my first thought, that it was some type of a herbicide damage. But then when you do investigations, you can see that it's not in that case. So anyway, there's all kinds of leaf discolorations and things that come up, but you just have to really investigate these things thoroughly. And if I find out what this is, I'll let y'all know. But as of right now, this is a mystery disease. What I've told the producer to do is, if we don't find out what it is, let's kill all those vines, because I don't want it to spread whatever it is. So we'll see if that takes care of it. But that's just another. This also showed up about Verazon and. So just something extra for you.
Appreciate you sharing those, Dr. Brandon. That is good stuff. Dr. Apple, is there anything that you see? I mean, we're obviously, we challenge with our elevation change here in Georgia and any state of kind of across the country, kind of flirting. We're in that 1,300 to 1,600 foot elevation where we are. A lot of our vineyards are in North Georgia. Texas, y'all have the same variability in elevation, but y'all are also seeing some Pierce's disease. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, a lot of the Pierce's disease is down in the coastal plain where the elevations are very, very low. And I don't think we get up quite as high as you do, but we also see Pierce's disease very commonly throughout the central part of the state, and even up into the Panhandle, where the elevations are higher. We see it there, but our highest pressure is along the coastal plain. The only thing I'd add, Philip's images were great. We see cases of freeze damage that makes localized freeze cankers on the cordons, and you don't always get a total vine collapse with crown gall. You can see these small infections up and down where the freeze cankers are, and in those cases you do see recovery. The vine isn't killed as readily as it is when it occurs on the lower trunks. We do get the same response, but we also see, you can look down the row and just see scattered small branches with red leaves on them. And as you go down and look, there's a small canker on the cordon right there where it attaches to the cordon. And I don't know if you're going to get to it, but we talked about it yesterday. We have some growers in Texas that actually swear by kerosene treatment for crown gall. Phil, I don't know if you get that, where they scrape it off and paint it with kerosene. And I'm sure JC's heard this a lot too in Texas. It does seem to be a very common response with the growers to take care of it.
We've had producers use kerosene. There is a commercial product that's also somewhat similar to kerosene. I don't know that I would attest that it works that well. I don't know that it doesn't work. It's one of those things where, the nature of the disease is such that it's really hard to tell whether you've done good with these types of things. But some of the producers really do swear by it, and they believe you can use the kerosene and actually kill out the gall tissue. But even if you kill out the gall tissue that's right there, the bacterium is still there, and it still can continue to form gall. And so it's not a systemic product, in other words. And so I don't make a comment about it in meetings. I don't really promote it. If somebody asks me about it, I'm kind of giving my hem and haw answer where I don't really say anything, but that's the best I can do with it.
Well, great discussion, and let's transition into, I'm ordering vines. It's that time of year. I'm placing my order of vines for my next year for spring planting. Obviously hopefully everybody knows that there are nurseries that do certified viral testing. But let's speak to that. Dr. Allaby, we talked about some of this yesterday. What are some tips and questions that and Libby, anybody feel free to comment on this. But so let's just kind of talk about how these things are transmitted, and then what nurseries are doing. And if I'm a buyer, what are the proper questions I need to ask?
Yeah, sure. So one thing you'll notice, from Philip's comment, and as well as comments by myself and a couple of other people, is sometimes we'll say something like, the infection came with the vine. So it tells you that the primary source of introducing these pathogens to the vineyard is through planting material, which means paying attention to the health status of those planting material is really very important. The good news is that in this country, we have clean plant centers, from coast to coast. These are centers that use best practices to produce nursery materials that have been certified, tested and certified free of major pathogens, including viruses, including major bacterial and other kinds of major diseases. And these clean plant centers, they even if a material is infected with a virus and it's such an important clone, that you really want to have. They even do, some of them do therapy where they could eliminate, the virus, from that particular material mass, and maybe through tissue culture, heat therapy, or a combination of some of those. And then many of those materials will be made available to, nurseries that can increase, those clean materials, and you can source your materials from them. But here's the question, so if you are going to plant a vineyard and you are sourcing those materials and somebody tells you it's certified, that's good. That's a very good start. But the question is, certified against what? Because different parts of the country, different nurseries, interpret, so those certifications, differently. They might say, well, it is certified against leaf roll, but no test was done for, say, crown gall and things like that. So it's important to ask, what are the pathogens, on the list of that particular certification, so you know exactly what you are getting. I'll throw this out there, and it's probably a little bit controversial. I've had growers in Texas a lot of times ask me and say, well, I just take vines from, my existing plants, and I take cuttings from those and I plant, another block of, that particular cultivar because I so much like it, and I don't have to go, to a nursery to buy all the time. And what I tell them is, look, if you must do that, I'm not recommending it, but if you must do it, one good thing to do is to, before you go all the way, take a few materials, send it to a diagnostic lab, have them tested. Probably out of 20 different vines, you might get a proportion of those that are free of the major viruses, leaf roll, red blotch, if viruses are your concern. And rather than do a blind sample, taking of cuttings from, vines and just planting and maybe moving the virus infection, further along in your vineyard, you can identify those ones that have been tested and tested negative for the viruses of concern, and you can actually, take your cuttings and propagate from those if you must do that. But the bottom line is that, we have, clean plant centers, from coast to coast. Many of those, the certified nurseries, get their, germplasm from them. And but you have to ask the right questions. What exactly are you concerned about, and are those on the list of things that those people actually certify the vine against?
So I get a question that I get all the time. So if I have a virus, or I had red blotch, or I have crown gall, did it come from the nursery? Can I blame them?
Oof.
It is yeah, I'll let Libby.
I mean, yes, I know my former supervisor had been involved in some lawsuits, and that does happen. I think if you really want to get to the bottom of it, you have to look at the distribution of the pathogen in the vineyard. And there's a lot of other digging that you can do as far as like looking at testing records that, from the nurseries, but it's a touchy subject. I would reiterate what Femi said though, and that's that I agree that the idea is a little controversial, but I think it's a good recommendation if you are propagating your own material to at least have it tested. And because yes, some of the certification programs around, some states have certification programs and some don't. And the certification program in California looks really different than the certification program in New York. So yes, that I would have the same advice to just ask the nurseries exactly what that material was tested for, and if the actual vines were tested. In most cases, that's not what actually happened. They've done testing on the mother vines at the nursery, but not on the vines that the grower is actually receiving. And so it's important, I think, to just ask exactly what was tested and when.
All good tips. Before I went out to the conference back in Austin, we just don't do a lot of propagation over here on the East Coast and just get new material, certified material to plant. But there is a lot of grafting, a lot of new plant starts, and So great advice, Dr. Albee, about getting those tested and certified. I mean, why would we risk it? Is it presumable to say that if they're brand new vines and you see these symptoms first year, that maybe it is more inclined that it was nursery? Because otherwise, is it possible that we see some of these issues, whether it be crown gall, red blotch, leaf roll, 3 or 4 years into a plant's life?
I would say there's two things that could be going on there. If you have virus symptoms that appear, across the whole vineyard in year 3 or 4, that could be that the rootstocks were infected, and that's just the infection manifesting in the scion after a couple of years. We've seen that a little bit with red blotch, so it can be confusing. But again, I would look at the distribution in the field, because if it's infection from the nursery, maybe not 100% of the vines will be infected, but it wouldn't look patchy, right? You can kind of tell the difference between what might be vector spread of the virus compared to infection at planting or a little bit later, based on the distribution of the symptoms in the field.
Yeah, the other thing I'll add to that also is, we have to keep in mind that, the primary means of spread of these viruses is mainly through, infected plant material, whether it's cotton or nursery material. But secondary spread do occur, through some certain insects. For leaf rolls, for example, mealybugs and scale insects. There are several species of mealybugs that can transmit different leaf roll viruses. For red blotch, there is a 3-cornered alfalfa tree hopper. And so if you are planting a new vineyard next to an already infected block of vines, then, when you start seeing symptoms early on, you might want to look at the distribution of those symptomatic plants, whether there is any evidence of directionality, because very likely, if you have an infected block and you're planting a new vineyard, you might have situations where the infection is moving from that old block to the new one. So everything will have to be on a case-by-case basis. Like Libby mentioned, it's very controversial. You can easily get dragged into lawsuits, and you just have to, read the situation and make an informed decision based on the read of the situation. If that vineyard is existing in the middle of a place where there's no history of grapevine cultivation, there are no riparian habitats and things like that, yeah, you are talking about a whole different situation. But even then, you still have to walk the rows, map the infected vines, and also even look at the virus population and see how they compare. There are a lot of things you have to do to be able to trace things back to whether it's coming from the nursery or not.
One thing that I think
we focus a lot on the viruses, but Xylella has been shown to be moved on cuttings as well, and certainly the canker-causing pathogens too can come in on nursery stock. As a matter of fact, they probably do come in. So there's a lot of risk of people moving cuttings around, and I know in Texas that's very, very common practice to move these things around.
Dr. Brandon?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to make a comment on crown gall in particular, just that, it can also come in from the nurseries. And we do know in some cases where we've had the rootstock and scions are identical in 2 different plantings side by side and 2 different nurseries involved. And one has a lot of crown gall and one has none. Well, you can point to the fact that has to be a nursery issue because everything else is the same. But the nurseries do have the option of using heat treatment, and some do, and that doesn't. It's not 100%. It's not going to get rid of all the crown gall bacterium that is in the plants, but it does help. And so I do think there are, those are questions you can ask your nurseries. Okay, are you getting or going through heat treatment? That's at least going to help, and I think it can be pretty effective if they're doing it well. So those are questions you can ask from your nurseries also.
JC?
Yeah, I was just going to say, we always recommend that growers buy certified nursery stock, but it's really important that they understand that just because your nursery stock is certified, that doesn't necessarily mean it's certified against every virus. So you not only want to buy certified stock, you want to know specifically which viruses is it certified against. Furthermore, just because it's certified against viruses doesn't mean it's certified against every pathogen. We occasionally will have people who assume that if they're buying certified nursery stock, that means it's been certified clean of everything. And obviously that's not the case. It isn't possible. So first and foremost, make sure you understand exactly what that certification means. And then with regard to going back to the nursery, if you end up, say you end up with some dirty plant material, my experience is if you are purchasing certified material and you end up with one of the pathogens that was certified against early on, again, so we're talking about the second leaf or showing up even in the first leaf. If you call your nursery, typically they're pretty good about working with you. They're not typically going to fight you on that. And I've seen some growers who've done that and had good results. So it's another good reason to, go to the extra expense of purchasing certified plant material. But again, just understanding what it is really that you're purchasing when you do that.
We got one question that Dr. Sarah Lauder from Georgia posed and has said, and wanted to ask the panel, how do y'all feel about sanitizing pruners, et cetera, between vines for some of these pathogens?
I don't think there's any evidence that red blotch or leaf roll are spread mechanically. But I don't know about Xylella.
There's one study that I think in the summer or something like that was done that did show that there was a very, very, very low transfer. But for most of your actual pruning, you're talking about doing it in the winter time here. And I don't think that's going to be an issue with Xylella at all on grapes. It may be in some other commodities, but if you're pruning in wintertime, no. And I think I've talked to somebody at some point about crown gall. And again, the same thing is true with winter pruning. Even though that is an injury event, it doesn't impact crown gall, nor does it, as far as I know, in any way spread it. So practically, there's just not a lot of reasoning behind doing that. You may, again, that you may be also spreading fungal type spores with pruning and those kind of operations also. But again, if you use a fungicide immediately behind the pruning, hopefully you can help reduce any kind of infections that come on with that. So practically, I think it's very difficult to do it. And then academically, I don't think there's a lot of reason based on what we do know right now to do it.
Sounds good. Well, one thing that I wanted to wrap this session up with, and we'll have to do it very briefly, and I'll allow each of you to kind of tell, but the theme of ASEV Eastern Section is just sharing what we're doing in our own states. So I would love to give each of you an opportunity to take, again, I'm going to put you on the spot, no more than 1 minute, to describe maybe some research that y'all are doing relative to some of these topics we've been discussing. Dave, we'll start with you.
Okay, and I'm going to be speaking on JC's behalf. One of the biggest research pushes that's going on, in my opinion, anyway, right now for the future of grape production in Texas is the use of the phage to control Pierce's disease. And JC's going to be focusing on this in great detail with some of the plots she's putting out right now. The phage is available in California and Texas, but the growers have a lot of questions about whether or not it's going to be efficacious or not.
Perfect. Dr. Albee.
Yeah, well, with respect to viruses, one thing that we've been doing over the last few years is in Texas, because of limitations of what you can grow due to Pierce's disease pressure, we have a lot of growers, growing hybrid grapes, things like Blanc du Bois. There's a newly released variety, Blanc du Soleil, and a lot of what we know about leaf roll and many of these other viruses is basically things we learned from red, vinifera cultivars. And so one of the things we're trying to find out is, these cultivars also, susceptible to many of these viruses? What kind of combination of viruses are in them? But more importantly, do we see the same impact reported for, say, some of these vinifera varieties showing up, in some of these hybrid varieties? So we are, measuring, yield, estimating yield impact, also looking at impact on berry quality, as well as hopefully do some work also on impact on wine chemistry. So we hope to be able to at least get some information for our growers, as regarding whether they need to be doing something differently and how to manage these hybrid grapes, due to because of any foreseeable virus impact.
I don't envy your position because there are a lot of varieties out there and hybrids are becoming popular. So that's a lot of testing, a lot of data to sort through. So thank you for spearheading that work. That sounds great. Libby, we'll pass it on to you. What's going on in Clemson?
Okay, so I've done very limited grapevine work since I've been at Clemson, but actually Phil introduced me to some of the growers in northern Georgia, and where we know that red blotch has been detected on some of those properties. So we've done over the last couple of years some sort of ecology studies trying to understand if and how red blotch is spreading across those vineyards. And in South Carolina, I mean, there's very limited wine grape production. There are a couple of wineries trying to get started a kind of along the northern part of the state. And our fruit crops physiologist here, Dr. Juan Carlos Melgar, he has a master's student who's currently testing some of Dr. Walker's from UC Davis, his Pierce's disease resistant cultivars. And so we'll see how they perform in South Carolina, but that work was just started. Those vines were planted earlier this year, so more to come, but very limited in South Carolina, to my dismay.
That's all right. Appreciate it. Yeah, Dr. Brannon?
Yeah, actually, personally, I'm not doing a whole lot with any of these pathogens we've talked about today. Sarah Louder is actually looking at the FOS for the Pierce's disease as well. And so she is doing some testing here in Georgia. And Libby's mentioned her virus stuff. We had recently, I say within the last 10 years, done a pretty comprehensive survey of viruses in Georgia. So we know what our problems are as far as viral type stuff. But as far as any immediate testing on the pathogens today, the answer is I'm not doing a whole lot there. I'm more interested right now in resistance management, especially looking at powdery mildew. So that's where I'm concentrating my efforts for the grape industry right now.
Absolutely. Want to leave an open spot here to, if anybody in the audience would like to have a question for our panelists, please feel free to raise your hand at the bottom. That'll put you at the top. I'd be glad to unmute you. Also, you can type it in the Q&A. While I give that folks a chance to type or think about a question, also if our audience can type in the box the state that they are representing. So again, sometimes I do that in the beginning so that our panelist knows where you're from. But if you're listening and still in tune and hadn't put you to sleep, you can still put in the chat box what state you are representing. Texas, Ohio, New York. All right, Texans did the word of getting the word out. Indiana, there we go. I really have enjoyed this conversation. Looks like we may have another question here. Oh, they put it in the wrong bit. Middle Georgia. Okay. Want to thank the panelists here today. It's been a great discussion. With any educational program, we have novices and we have people who know it well. But y'all are in Texas, we're in Georgia, and on the East Coast, Clemson. What's great is the sharing of information. We're all facing the same challenges. We look forward to hearing the work that comes out of Texas A&M. It's just great that everybody's spearheading this viruses. Dr. Albee, who else would be doing virus work up north in Oregon? Would they have virologists up there? Who else?
California, Oregon, Washington State, the entire gambit. We have a lot of people working on these issues.
Yeah, New York, Missouri.
Missouri. Yeah.
So the short of it is you kind of know who to contact. You can start out with your local extension university, and hopefully they have some specialists in the wine grape region, and then carried up the line up to finding out the labs that you need to do for testing. And as we said, we didn't really speak too much on testing, but there are labs across the country, some private, some at universities. So that does exist out there. I don't know the cost associated with those, but to know that you can, and there is a proper, I will just close with, there is a proper way to sample. I know Dr. Albee, we didn't get a chance to talk about that too much today, but you don't just send one leaf, that it's very important that you're sampling from a cross-sectional, horizontal and longitudinal from that vine all around, because we don't want to have any negative positive, positive negatives, and it's just one result. We need to have a nice sampling from across the entire vine. So anybody listening in that's new to that, know that there is a way and there's a procedure for all these samplings. Well, we're going to conclude with that. Thank you so much for coming. Again, our audience can check out the ASEV Eastern Section website to learn more about us, and we'd love to have you join. But I'm going to stop recording.